record players. My guest today is a man who anyone of my generation will remember as Canada's first ever VJ, along with names like Michael Williams, Erica M, and JD Roberts. He brought all the new music videos and music news to the country on the very beginning of MuchMusic, Canada's MTV. He was working long before that behind the camera, continuing his first career as a songwriter and a musician. He's responsible for songs recorded by Backstreet Boys, Diana Ross, Chicago's Peter Cetera, and of course the hits Beautiful Goodbye by our own Amanda Marshall, and his biggest hit, the epic Alannah Myles hit Black Velvet. Last year he released his first album, in decades, featuring his own takes on some of his own hit songs, and recently he's re-released his debut called Spark of Desire. Christopher Ward is with us on TRP. How are you?
Yeah, I know that guy.
A little younger.
But only vaguely, only distantly.
A little younger. Did you think about changing the cover when you re-released it and doing like a new?
We actually did try a couple of things. Funny you would ask. But they were just like, well, it looks like you're trying to make it look different for the sake of doing it. So we ended up just going with the original.
I would have put
And besides, there are no covers now anyway. There's just a photo of a cover. So, right?
Have you been getting used to the cold weather here? But you're in California, so how you doing in there? How's things?
I'm doing just fine. That's always a loaded question from someone who's in Canada, though. I have to be careful what I say. I can't sound too smug about it, you know?
I mentioned MuchMusic off the top, of course, but for me, some of my earliest memories as a kid was staying up all night on weekends, on Fridays and Saturday nights, or was it Saturdays and Sundays, watching City Limits on Citytv. That's where you became this country's first VJ. For those that remember, weekends only, middle of the night, of course, we were staying up to watch. It was the only place we could see boobs, Christopher, on Duran Duran's Girls on Film. What was you couldn't see
did
that.
Did we play the uncut version? I guess we did. Huh?
Yeah, you guys were the only place that would play the unedited. And 13-year-old boys everywhere were staying up all night.
Did I cheer or apologize? I'm not really sure. Heather, how can weigh on this one? That was a pretty crazy show. It was you were right. It was Friday and Saturday nights till 6 o'clock in the morning, and we tried to stay awake and keep ourselves amused. And artists would come down and visit, and it was chaos on television. It was fun.
It was the pre-MuchMusic. It was kind of what MuchMusic like went into, right? Was
exactly. It was designed that way. It was meant to be like a test run for that style of programming, and it was a precursor to Much in spirit as well as in content.
Mm-hmm. Mike Myers was a guest on that show once, doing his Wayne character long before SNL, long before Wayne's World.
Yeah.
You also worked with, I mean, I've always wanted to ask this because Austin Powers is one of my favorite movies. So I've always wanted to ask you about the Ming Tea thing. Years later, Austin Powers, you do the Ming Tea, the fake band or whatever you want to call it with Mike Myers.
What do you mean fake?
Sorry, not fake. In a movie, the band in the movie, within the movie.
Yeah,
Why did Ming Tea never? Who was in that? That was you, Matthew Sweet, Mike Myers, and Susanna Hoffs from the Bangles.
Yeah, and Stuart Johnson was the drummer. He was Matthew's drummer. Yeah.
Why was there never a Ming Tea record? Why did that never come to be?
We talked about it, and we did some gigs. We played the Viper Room, and we played Groundlings Theater. We did a few things. We did a VH1 show as well. I don't mean it's all up to Mike to whether something like that follows or not. And you're right, he did Wayne on City Limits for the very first time, but he did it a whole bunch of times. He was a regular on the show, and that's because he and I had been in the Second City touring company together, and we used to do scenes where Wayne would appear on stage in those shows. And so it was just kind of a natural when the TV show came along that he'd come down and make fun of it. It was great.
From there, you went, of course, into MuchMusic, and you guys were just ruling the country for the longest time there. You were there for many years. What was that scene like at that time, downtown Toronto? A little bit more accessible now than television, or then than television is now, to the public, and bringing in people into the studio, that kind of thing. What was it like being sort of that first wave of doing that kind of thing in Canada?
It was fantastic. I mean, as we've said, it was kind of seat of the pants style television. There wasn't a lot of planning, but that just meant you had to kind of be ready to improvise and be in the moment. And the artists really took to that, we found, because it wasn't canned. It wasn't like, a typical interview where you just ask the questions that are on the list and then you move on to the next question and so on. I mean, this was just wild, hair up your butt TV. And we loved it, and I think the audience did too. I think they, I mean, we would make fools of ourselves sometimes, but it's kind of like watching improv comedy. You're loving when they make fools of themselves, and you're watching to see how they're going to pick themselves up and put themselves back together again, right? So, um, but we had such free reign, and we would do things with the artists. All you had to do was ask. I mean, it's like Bon Jovi had been on City Limits before they had any fans whatsoever. They literally had 20 people that came to see them at the El Macambo, and the record company rep begged us to have them on, and we were like, yeah, sure. So they came down, did a thing on Limits, and then 4 years later, after Slippery When Wet had sold 11 million copies, they said, well, we're only doing one show, and they came and did my show on Much. And we had a barbecue and they cooked, and it was just that kind of chaos. I mean, you probably saw some of the Duran Duran stuff with
Yeah,
Erica.
yeah.
I mean, that was just nutty television, but I think very entertaining.
Well, and you guys all had kind of your favorite bands. I mean, you mentioned Erica with Duran Duran. I remember Jeannie Becker doing crowded house stuff all the time on the new music. JD Roberts had his favorites that he always seemed to be the one to interview. Was there, other than the Bon Jovi thing, was there anybody that you were always the guy when they came in?
Well, it only happened once, and I was glad that I was the guy when George Harrison
Oh
arrived
man,
because, I mean, a Beatle walking into Much, as you say, it's the kind of thing security wise that would never happen today for so many reasons. Um, and that was magic. That was just, you kind of pinching yourself thinking, am I really sitting here and talking to somebody whose music I've been listening to since I was 14, It's like the interview that I had prepared my whole life for. Um,
unbelievable.
but I mean, I got a lot of great interviews. I mean, I interviewed Whitney Houston and Leonard Cohen and Peter Gabriel and Tina Turner and Kate Bush, and I mean, it just they just kept parading through. And I think the medium, because it was new, they wanted to take advantage of it. And most of the artists that I just mentioned have a very strong sort of visual aspect to what they do.
Right.
So, we were the only game in town, and it wasn't like a national television show.
It was the perfect platform, that's for sure. You
Yeah.
are you're an acclaimed musician and a songwriter long before Much Music, long after Much Music. You've written some of I mentioned off the top, you've written some of this country's most recognizable songs. Two in
Thank you.
particular that come to mind, obviously, are the Beautiful Goodbye, which Amanda Marshall recorded,
Right.
and Black Velvet. I mean, you've been asked probably a gajillion times about Black Velvet. I want to hear the story myself. How did Black Velvet come about? How was it written? What's the story behind it? Loaded question again, a lot to it, but talk to me about Black Velvet.
Well, you're entitled to ask. I always, when I did interviews with people who'd had some kind of success, I always asked the questions I wanted to know the answers to. So um, it was written. I was on assignment for the New Music Show, which I did occasional stories for. They put me on a Greyhound bus with a cameraman and 40 Elvis fanatics, and we drove to Memphis, Tennessee for Elvis Week on the 10th anniversary of his death. While I was on the bus, I had lots of time to myself, and I was reading to research my story on Elvis, and I started making notes, and those notes became the lyrics for Black Velvet. And I brought it back home. I had the lyric ideas, and then musically, I would do that thing that every songwriter does, which is you drive the neighbors absolutely batty because you play the same thing over and over and over again until you get something. You just kind of, it's almost like it's a hypnotic process, sitting there playing that, just doing it for hours on end. And then the lyric just kind of dropped into that musical space. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a whole other aspect of the story as to how it became a success, but that's kind of the creative gist of it.
Beautiful Goodbye, was that written for Amanda? Did you write that for Amanda Marshall, or was that something that you had already written that you gave to her to record?
That's a good question, and it's not maybe what people will think. It was not written for Amanda. She had come to LA to work with Dave Tyson as her producer,
Mhm.
and Dave brought me in as a songwriter to work on a couple of things for her, and I just was blown away by her abilities as a singer and interpreter. And we pulled out a whole bunch of songs that we had been working on around that time, which included Beautiful Goodbye. It was finished. And we sort of went, well, you're not going to be interested in this one. She's like, oh no, I like this one. And we're like, yeah, we'd written it for like a Joe Cocker or somebody like that. We thought it had this, I don't know, like the voice of somebody who had a whole world of experience and broken romances and everything else. And here she was, this, 20-year-old, kid with the energy of 100 men. I mean, she was just, it was like an antithetical kind of setup. And she said, no, 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 let me try, let me try, let me try. We're like, okay, yeah, sure, go ahead, fill your hat. We were being the old guys, like the know-it-alls, right? So she goes back to where she's staying and learns the song and comes back the next day and we fire up the track. And I'm literally sitting like just cheek to jowl here with her and then the tape recorder's rolling. And she starts in, I just was like, oh. I mean, right from that opening line, I'm fed up with my destiny, this place of no return. She just killed it.
Yeah.
And I looked over at Dave and I was like, are you recording? He goes,
And he,
yes. And that first pass, much of that take is what's on the record.
wow,
She is that good.
she is. I saw her going back to the Much Music. I saw her at her Intimate and Interactive on Much
Oh,
Music. I
what
was
a
at
great show
that.
that was. I remember there. Yeah.
Unbelievable. She is phenomenal. Last year you recorded, well, you probably didn't record it last year, but released Same River Twice,
Yeah.
which was a record that you put out, sort of reimagining some of your older songs,
Mm.
you performing them, you singing them. What's it like? I mean, obviously it's your song, but when people hear Black Velvet, for example, they think of Alannah's voice. When people hear other songs, they think of that voice that you gave the song to. What's it like to go in and you know, give it your own voice, and how different is
Well, thank heavens they think of those voices, not mine.
it? You've got a very good voice, Kristen.
Well, thank you. I wasn't fishing for compliments. It was more just like, I mean, Alannah's version is the definitive version of that song, and it always will be. She, wears that song. She owns it, shall we say? And same with Amanda and Beautiful Goodbye. Um, so it was a challenge to think, oh, what can I do that's different? I thought with Black Velvet I needed to do the songwriter's take on it. And for me, it was that process that I described to you about writing the song, just kind of sitting there, middle of the night, quietly thumping away on the bass strings and on the guitar, and then trying to imagine an environment, and actually, I'll give this away, but on the vinyl version, there are some crickets that we laid in on the track because we just thought, like it's got that atmospheric kind of southern late
Desert.
night feeling, and
Yeah.
yeah. So there's that. And then because I don't obviously sing like Alannah, I had to use my veteran wiles and just kind of draw people into the story of the song more than me being like a big vocalist. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So it was a challenge, but I wasn't even going to do it originally because I just thought people are going to compare it to Alannah and I'm not going to come off well. It's just not
Well,
going to,
it
but
is
people,
hard, even though it's your song. It's a gutsy thing to do because of that reason, right? So,
well, the guys I was working with, I said, I don't know. And they're like, you're doing it. It was just like, no, you're doing it. You're doing Black Velvet. I'm like, oh, okay.
you got told.
I
Um,
got told.
you've just re-released Spark of Desire, which we talked about off the top. I mentioned
Yeah,
1978, I believe, was one of
that is correct.
them. Obviously, a very special record for you. Are there any songs on the album that maybe even you had forgotten about that you want people to go back and listen to now that it's back out?
That's a great question, because it was a process of rediscovery for me. I had not listened to that music in a very long time. I mean, a couple of the songs, Once in a Long Time and Maybe Your Heart, you hear them on the radio now and then.
Yeah.
At least in Canada, you do. Um, but I was amazed by a number of things. First of all, sonically, how strong it is. That record stands up, and that's all 100% due to the genius of Jack Richardson, the late great Jack Richardson, for whom the Juno for producer of the year is named, by the way.
Yeah.
And he produced, all the Guess Who records, and yeah, he did a lot of great stuff. But also the musicianship. I mean, I had all these jazz guys like the Brecker brothers and Mo Kaufman and Guido Basso, and on drums, Steve Ferrone, who played with Clapton, who was in Tom Petty's band for like 25 years. I mean, when you have players like that and a producer like Jack, it's hard to go wrong in some ways. As a songwriter, I look back and go, "Oh, I'd love to have that one again." I just love to fix that. But we're all we creative types are obsessive about things like that anyway. And there comes a point where, the old expression, "It ain't final till it's vinyl," and you kind of have to just let it go. But I would say, in answer to your question, and that took me a long time to get to it, that if there was a song on there that I would say listen to, it would be the song called "Nightbirds." It's a really interesting song musically, and I worked with a collaborator in those days, a guy named Stephen Stone, and Stephen wrote the melodies for those songs, and I just want to give him his due, like Maybe You're Hard and Once in a Long Time, and those are big, sweeping, very memorable melodies, and so my contribution was singing them, but also writing the lyric. And I think Nightbirds is an interesting one, so check it out.
Um, Before I let you go, I want to go back to MuchMusic and the interviews. You kind of mentioned George Harrison, so that probably answers that question. Did you ever have what was your worst? What was the most awkward interview you ever did that you just cringe at?
Oh man, there's a few of those. It's funny because when I wrote a book about the history of MuchMusic called "Is This Live?" Inside the Wild Early Years of MuchMusic, and that was a question that I asked the people I was interviewing, the on-air people, that is, and they all had some interesting answers, mostly centering around Gene Simmons and Kiss. But I mean, there's so many that I go, ugh. One of the worst ones, only because it was so bizarre, was Motorhead, because they asked me to host the Power Hour, which I never did. Clearly, as you've said, certain VJs had certain types of interviews they would do. The metal music was not my forte, as you can easily imagine. Yeah, give him Peter Gabriel, but Motorhead. And I think it was a case where the host of the show, whether it was Laurie or JD, was away, and so I had to fill in. So Lemmy and Filthy Phil from Motorhead showed up, and I don't really know
Just
much
imagine
about.
where this is going.
Well, for starters, it went to the sub basement down in the boiler room, and so the setting was just very pre-industrial looking, and they each had been given a 26er of something. I think in Lemmy's case it was Jack Daniels, and I think it was gin for Phil. And basically, over the course of the 1 hour show, each of them consumed both of those bottles, and so it got so out of hand. And by the end of it all, we had this life-size poster to give away for their most recent album, which was conveniently called "Eat the Rich," and so I started like, "Hey, be sure to send in your entries for this." Blah, blah, blah. And I'm holding it up, and while I'm doing this, they both decide they're going to eat the poster. So they're like chewing it and swallowing it from the side. I just thought, well, I might as well just continue on as if there's nothing unusual or out of the ordinary happening here. But that was pretty weird, wouldn't you say?
And again, something that would never in a million years happen on today's television, right? Couldn't happen on
Probably not.
today. Couldn't possibly happen on today.
But I'm glad it did. I'm happy that I was there for that moment.
Oh, I remember some of the MuchMusic things. I remember some of the Christmas tree tosses and some of the stuff that
Oh,
happened
yeah.
that and there was no, 5-second delay. There was things that got said on air, and I remember watching it going, wow, can they do that?
Like every time the Red Hot Chili Peppers came on, yeah.
Yes, yes, for example. um, you have a podcast. Are you still doing the podcast Famous Last Words?
Yes, it's Famous Lost
Lost
Words,
Words, sorry.
and it's my partner Tom Jokic a wonderful radio producer and archivist, and he digs through all of these interviews in this massive archive, and from that he pulls the best bits, and then we just play them and talk about them. I mean, it's kind of like jamming. It's really, really fun to do. So yeah, check it out. And it's I guess I'm supposed to say things like wherever you get your favorite podcast, check out Famous Lost Words, right?
Well, I'm about to do that kind of a line. I've interviewed a lot of musicians and a lot of broadcasters. I've never interviewed one that did both, so that it was a thrill for me to talk a little bit about both of those things with you.
Great.
Thank you for taking the time with us. Again, Spark of Desire, Christopher Ward, re-released from 1978, and it can be found on, see, this is what I'm about to do. It can be found on all the popular streaming services as well as www.christopherward.ca. Much appreciated you being with us in the record player, Christopher. It's been a pleasure, and wish you the happiest of holidays, and thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on the show, Scott. It was really a pleasure.
Anytime. Take care, my friend.
All right.